I thought my family was falling apart, but we found strength in each other, Reddit stories. The kitchen was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Morning light spilled through the window, cutting across the table where a half-empty coffee mug sat beside a folded newspaper. Margaret stared into the steam rising from her cup, her fingers absently tracing the chipped edge of the handle. She had always believed that time healed everything. But lately, time felt like a slow unraveling, an invisible thread tugging at the seams of her family. It started small, as these things often do. Her eldest son, Daniel, had stopped calling as often. At first, she chalked it up to his promotion at the law firm. Longer hours, more stress. He'll come around, she had told herself and her husband, Glenn, when they sat together on the porch one evening. Glenn had only nodded, his eyes distant, as if he was already seeing something Margaret couldn't. Then came the silence from their daughter, Emily. Once the talkative, emotional heart of the family, Emily had begun to respond with curt text messages and missed visits. She had always been sensitive, the kind of person who cried during commercials. And Margaret wondered if she had said something wrong, if maybe the last phone call ended on a note sharper than she realized. What truly shook the house, though, was what happened at Christmas. The whole family had gathered, the first time in months. The tree was lit, Margaret's gingerbread cookies filled the air with warmth, and soft jazz played in the background. Daniel brought his new girlfriend, Claire, and Emily arrived late, looking tired, hugging everyone with a stiffness Margaret hadn't seen in her before. Dinner had started well enough. Wine was poured, stories were exchanged, laughter echoed from the living room as the children, Margaret's grandkids, played with the new toys under the tree. But somewhere between the second bottle of wine and dessert, it happened. Emily had asked Daniel a simple question about a shared memory from their childhood, something about the lake house and the old canoe. But Daniel's response was clipped. "That never happened," he said, frowning. "You always twist things around." Emily had gone quiet, her lips pressed into a thin line. Glenn tried to change the subject, asking Claire about her job, but the moment had already shifted. The air was heavy, tense. Then Emily, eyes glossy, pushed her chair back and stood. "I think I'm going to head out early," she said. Margaret had tried to stop her, reaching out a hand. "Honey, stay. We haven't even opened gifts." Emily shook her head. "It's not about the gifts, Mom. It's never been about the gifts." And she was gone. Daniel looked frustrated, embarrassed maybe. Claire excused herself to help with the dishes, and Glenn just sat there, quiet, staring at the empty seat Emily left behind. That night, after the guests left and the wrapping paper lay in torn shreds on the floor, Margaret sat beside the tree, staring at the blinking lights. She felt like she was watching a house slowly crack, unable to find the right tool to patch it. The smiles at the beginning of the evening felt fake in hindsight, or maybe desperate. "Do you think we did something wrong?" she asked Glenn. He didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, he said, "I think we all did something wrong. We just didn't realize it until it was too late." Those words clung to her for days. Margaret began to go through old photo albums, looking at images of beach trips, birthday parties, school plays. There they were, Daniel and Emily as kids, smiling, arms wrapped around each other. What happened to that warmth? When did it fade? Was it when they moved to the city? When Glenn lost his job for a few years? When Margaret herself became so wrapped up in her volunteer work at the hospital that she barely noticed the distance growing between her children? The past, she realized, was full of moments that felt small at the time, but now looked enormous in retrospect. One afternoon in January, Margaret found herself at Emily's apartment. She hadn't warned her daughter she was coming, fearing the call might be declined. She knocked twice, heard shuffling behind the door, and then Emily's face appeared. Pale, tired, guarded. "Mom," she said, surprised. "I was in the neighborhood," Margaret lied. "Can I come in for a minute?" Emily hesitated but opened the door. The apartment smelled like lavender and books. A cat darted past Margaret's legs. They sat in the living room, the silence between them thick. "Emily." Margaret began, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry." "For what?" Emily's voice was soft but sharp. "For not noticing. For not listening when I should have. For not asking how you were feeling all those times I just assumed everything was fine." Emily's eyes welled. She didn't speak right away. Then, in a voice so low Margaret barely caught it, she said, "It's not just about the lake house, Mom. It's everything. Daniel always got the attention. He always got forgiven. And I had to be perfect just to be seen. I was tired of competing in a race I didn't even know I was running." Margaret's breath caught. The words struck like thunder, because deep down, she knew there was truth in them. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that," Margaret whispered. "I know," Emily replied. "But you did. And it's not just about knowing now. It's about showing you want to fix it." "I do. I want us to be close again." Emily looked at her, really looked at her, and Margaret saw not a child, not a teenager, but a woman who had quietly carried years of emotional weight without anyone noticing. "I want that too," Emily said. They talked for hours after that. About Daniel, about the past, about what healing might look like. Not overnight, not through forced holidays or pretty family portraits, but through real conversations, vulnerability, and time. When Margaret left, Emily hugged her tighter than she had in years. Later that week, Margaret called Daniel. She asked to meet, not just to talk, but to listen, to open the door to something better. Because she had learned that families don't fall apart in one grand moment. They unravel thread by thread. But they can also be rewoven. And Margaret was ready to start suing. To be continued. Let me know if you'd like the second part with Daniel's perspective and how the family begins confronting its history more deeply. The buzzing of Daniel's phone on his mahogany desk cut through the silence of his corner office. He barely glanced at it, eyes glued to the glowing screen of his laptop. Another contract, another review, another late night. He rubbed his temple, blinking away the dull ache behind his eyes. The name Mom flickered on his phone for a second before fading back to the lock screen. He let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. It wasn't that he didn't want to answer. He just didn't know how. Ever since Christmas, something had shifted. The silence between him and Emily wasn't new, but the way it had exploded that night left a lingering sting. Her sudden departure, the hurt in her voice, had stuck with him. But even more so, what hurt was the look on his mother's face, a mixture of confusion, regret, and something else. A silent plea, maybe. For as long as he could remember, Daniel had carried the unspoken role of the responsible one, the golden child, the achiever, straight-A student, debate team captain, law school scholarship recipient. Everyone always expected greatness from him, and he had delivered, at the cost of becoming something of a machine. Goals, results, performance. But underneath, there was fatigue, resentment, and something he rarely admitted, loneliness. He hadn't spoken to Emily since Christmas. Not a call. Not even a message. Not because he was angry, but because he didn't know what to say. He hadn't realized she'd felt so overlooked, so outshined. He didn't even know she saw things that way. Growing up, she was the creative one, the emotional one. The one who danced around the house and painted stars on her ceiling. Daniel thought she had always wanted her own path, that she liked being different. He hadn't known she felt like she was competing. The thought gnawed at him. Later that week, Daniel finally met up with Margaret. They sat at a small cafe she liked downtown. He arrived late. Traffic, meetings, the usual excuses. But when he saw her there, coat neatly folded over the back of her chair, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, he felt a weight pressed down on his chest. "Sorry," he mumbled, sliding into the seat across from her. Margaret smiled gently. You always say that." There was no bitterness in her voice, just observation. Daniel lowered his eyes, unsure how to respond. For a moment, they both just sipped their drinks. Then Margaret said, I visited Emily. Daniel's heart gave a thump. How is she? Hurt, she answered honestly, but willing to heal. If we are. He nodded slowly, staring at the ripples in his coffee. I didn't realize. I never meant to push her away. I know, Margaret said. But meaning well isn't always enough. He looked up at her. She looked older than he remembered. Softer somehow. You know, when you were little, she continued, you used to tell me you were afraid of being boring. You thought if you didn't impress people, they wouldn't love you. Daniel blinked. I don't even remember that. I do. She gave a sad smile. And I think we reinforced that fear. We praised your grades, your medals, your mere accomplishments. And somewhere along the way, I think we forgot to ask how you were really doing. Daniel swallowed. Something inside him shifted. He wasn't used to being seen like that. Not as a lawyer, not as the eldest, not as someone who always had the answers. I think I forgot too, he said. Forgot how to be a brother or a son. Margaret reached out and placed her hand over his. It's not too late. He nodded. I want to fix it. With Emily. With you. They left the cafe with a plan. Margaret would arrange a small family dinner. No decorations, no pressure, just the three of them, and maybe Glenn if he wanted to come. A reset button. No fancy food, no expectations, just honesty. Daniel texted Emily that night. Hey Em, I know we haven't talked since Christmas. I'd like to change that. I miss you. Would you be willing to come to dinner this Sunday? Just Mom, me, you, and maybe Dad. There was no immediate response. He waited, staring at the screen longer than he wanted to admit. Then, 15 minutes later, okay? One dinner, but I want real conversations, no pretending. Daniel exhaled and typed back, agreed. No pretending. Sunday came with quiet snowfall blanketing the street. Margaret kept the food simple. Roasted chicken, vegetables, mashed potatoes. Glenn stayed quiet in the kitchen, chopping herbs with mechanical focus. He hadn't said much since Christmas, but Margaret knew he was carrying the guilt in his own way. Emily arrived right on time. She wore a green coat and a gray scarf, her hair tucked behind her ears. She looked cautious but calm. Daniel stood when she entered. Hey, he said.
Yeah,
She replied, scanning the room like she was entering a courtroom herself. They sat. The beginning was awkward. Margaret tried small talk, the weather, new books. Glenn nodded occasionally. Emily answered in short bursts. Daniel mostly kept quiet. Then, after a moment of silence, Daniel cleared his throat. Emily, he said, I owe you an apology. She turned toward him slowly. For not listening. For acting like my version of things was the only one that mattered. I think I spent a long time believing I had to live up to this image. And I didn't realize how that affected you. I'm sorry. Emily blinked. Her lips parted slightly, like she wasn't expecting that. She looked at their mother, then back at Daniel. I used to think you were just arrogant, she said carefully. But now, I think you were just scared. Like the rest of us. Daniel nodded. Yeah, I think I was. Margaret reached for a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. I didn't see any of it, she admitted. I thought as long as we were all succeeding. Jobs, school promotions, then we were okay, but we weren't. No, Emily said. We weren't pot, but we can be. Glenn added, finally speaking. His voice was quiet but steady. If we choose to be. Silence fell again, but this time it was gentler. Not a wall, more like a pause before a bridge is crossed. They talked for hours after that, about the past. Daniel's pressure to always win, Emily's quiet feelings of being invisible, the way their parents unintentionally created roles neither of them wanted. About their fears, their mistakes, their hopes. There were tears. There was laughter, too. Remembering the time Daniel tried to teach Emily how to ride a bike and ended up crashing into the mailbox himself. Glenn smiled more than Margaret had seen in weeks. Emily's face softened. Something began to knit together again. No dramatic hugs, no perfect closure. But something real. At the end of the night, as they stood by the door, Emily looked at Daniel. We should talk more, she said. We should, he agreed. They hugged, brief, but honest. When everyone had gone, Margaret stood at the sink, rinsing plates. Glenn came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. We did okay tonight, he said. We did better than okay, she whispered, because healing doesn't come with one apology or one dinner. It's a process, a decision made again and again. And that night, for the first time in a long time, their family had chosen each other. To be continued, let me know if you'd like part 2 to explore the rebuilding phase. Maybe a family trip, therapy, or how the siblings support each other through personal struggles. The first time they laughed together again. Really laughed. It happened by accident. It was 2 weeks after the family dinner, on a chilly Friday night, when Emily called Daniel out of the blue. You're not going to believe what Mom did, she said the second he answered. Daniel blinked, momentarily stunned to hear her voice so light, almost amused. What happened? She signed up for a pottery class. Daniel nearly dropped his phone. What? Pottery? Clay? Wheel spinning? The whole ghost movie fantasy. She says it's part of her self-expansion journey now that she's semi-retired. Daniel burst out laughing. That is exactly the kind of midlife rebrand I never saw coming. She invited me to join, but I think I'd rather not end up accidentally creating a lopsided cereal bowl in front of 5 strangers. Daniel chuckled again. You should have gone. At least you'd have a story. I already have one, Emily said, and for a moment there was silence. Then she added more seriously, I'm glad you picked up. I always will, he replied. That call became the first of many, short ones at first, texts during lunch breaks, voice notes about annoying coworkers or awkward dates. Daniel started to feel like he was getting to know his sister again. Not the version he had grown up with or the distant image she became in adulthood, but the real her. The woman who loved reading memoirs and was learning to set boundaries. The one who made playlists for her moods and still cried during Pixar movies. It was strange and beautiful. Margaret, true to her word, began to change too. She called more often, but not just to check in or list off family updates. She asked questions. She listened, and sometimes she even shared her own vulnerabilities, things she had kept buried for decades. I used to think if I showed weakness, the family would fall apart, she confessed to Emily one evening as they sipped wine on the porch. But that's not true, Emily replied. You're not the glue holding us together. Mom, we all are. Glenn remained a quiet presence, the steady anchor. He didn't say much, but he started joining more conversations, suggesting game nights, offering to help Emily fix her leaky sink, even learning how to text. Painfully slow, but heartfelt. His messages always ended with unnecessary punctuation. How are you, Dad? The family was changing, not in big, cinematic ways, but in the quiet, meaningful moments. Then came the idea for the cabin. It was Daniel who brought it up, hesitantly, during one of their newly revived Sunday dinners. I was thinking, he said between bites of roast chicken, maybe we could all take a trip this spring, together, somewhere quiet, like the old lake house. Margaret looked up. You mean the one we used to rent every summer? He nodded. It's still there, I checked. They renovated it, apparently. Emily raised an eyebrow. You want us to go back there? Not for nostalgia, he said, but maybe for closure. Glenn leaned forward. I think it's a good idea. Emily hesitated, then slowly nodded. All right, one weekend. No work calls, no arguments. Deal? Daniel said, smiling. The lake house was almost exactly as they remembered it, except cleaner, brighter, and with a brand new deck overlooking the water. It felt surreal, walking through the halls that once echoed with childhood fights and late night board games. Margaret stood in the kitchen, fingers trailing across the countertops. I used to burn everything in here, she murmured. Your dad always claimed it gave the food character. Daniel and Emily laughed. They unpacked groceries, made a schedule for meals, and settled into the cozy rhythm of being together. They brought books, puzzles, and even Margaret's attempt at homemade clay mugs, each lumpy and endearing. On the second night, a storm rolled in. Rain tapped against the windows like a metronome, and thunder rumbled low across the lake. They lit a fire, sat in the living room, and played a card game that none of them remembered how to properly score. Laughter spilled out in bursts. Then the power went out. Just like that, the lights blinked off and silence took over. For a moment, they all just sat there in the dark blinking. Glenn sighed. Just like the summer of '98, Daniel chuckled. The raccoon incident. Oh no, Emily groaned. Don't remind me, but Margaret grinned. That raccoon ate better than we did. It stole the hot dogs and then dragged an entire loaf of bread into the woods. They laughed harder this time. Not just at the memory, but at the realization that they could laugh together again. They found flashlights, lit candles, and sat by the fire. The mood shifted. Softer now. Calmer. Emily looked at her brother. Did you ever feel responsible for everything when we were kids? Daniel thought for a moment. Yeah. I felt like if I didn't hold it together, no one would. Like I had to keep achieving so things wouldn't fall apart. But Emily nodded. And I felt like if I spoke up about how I felt, I'd be blamed for ruining things. Like I had to stay quiet so you could shine. They both sat with those truths in silence. Margaret placed a hand on each of theirs. You both did more than you should have. And I let you. I'm sorry. Glenn added. We all have regrets. But sitting here now, I think we're doing okay. Emily leaned back. Better than okay? The power returned the next morning, but something had already been restored between them. Not just electricity, but connection. Over the next few weeks, life resumed. But now, everything felt lighter. Emily started attending therapy more regularly, encouraged by Daniel. She even invited Margaret to a few sessions. Not because she needed her mother there, but because she wanted her there. Daniel cut back on weekend hours and started mentoring junior associates, choosing to be the kind of support he never had. He also found the courage to ask Claire if she wanted to try again. Not as the man who buried himself in work, but as someone who was finally learning to be present. It would take time, but she agreed to dinner. Margaret took up yoga and, much to everyone's amusement, began selling her hand-molded clay mugs online as abstract artisan drinkware. Got her tagline, perfectly imperfect. Just like family, Glenn began writing short stories, fiction mostly. But Daniel recognized their old dog Pepper in one, and Emily swore she saw a version of herself in a quiet girl who learned to sing again after years of silence. Their wounds didn't vanish. They simply became part of the story. Not the defining chapters, but the ones that led to healing. One afternoon, a package arrived at Emily's door. Inside was a photo album. Real paper pages, hand-labeled, filled with printed photographs. Not the curated, filtered kind from Instagram, but honest snapshots. From the cabin, from Sunday dinners, from awkward hugs and pancake breakfasts. A sticky note was stuck to the first page. For the family we're still becoming. Love, Mom. Emily ran her fingers over the pictures, her eyes stinging in the best way, because she finally believed it. They were becoming a family again. Not the one from glossy Christmas cards or forced smiles, but a real one. Messy, flawed, trying, and for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. To be continued. Would you like part of E to focus on the next chapter? Perhaps a wedding, a crisis that tests their bond, or how the family supports one another through new beginnings. It had been nearly a year since the family dinner that changed everything. A year since Emily had walked out of Christmas. A year since Daniel realized he didn't really know his sister. A year since Margaret stopped trying to keep up appearances and started trying to understand. A year since Glenn found his voice again, and it had been, all things considered, a good year. The kind of year stitched together not with grand milestones, but with small victories. Check, in calls that turned into hour-long conversations. Sunday dinners that became routine again. A trip to the cabin that reminded them who they were before the world made them forget. But as Margaret always said, no family stays still forever. There are always seasons, and some of them bring storms. This time, the storm came not with lightning or thunder, but in the form of a diagnosis. Glenn, the first signs were subtle. A misplaced wallet, forgotten names, slower speech. At first, Margaret brushed it off as normal aging. Glenn was in his mid-60s. Slips were expected, but then he started getting lost on the way home from the grocery store. Once, he called Daniel 3 times in a single day, each time asking the same question about the water heater. They ran tests, waited for results, and one rainy November afternoon, Margaret got the call she hoped would never come. Early-onset Alzheimer's. She sat in the kitchen, phone still in her hand, as the light outside faded. The mug beside her was cold. The air felt too quiet. When Daniel came over that evening, he found her sitting at the table, staring at the clock. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. Daniel sat beside her and took her hand. "We'll figure it out, together." But Emily was there the next day. She cried when Margaret told her. Long, silent tears that rolled down her cheeks as she clutched her father's hand. Glenn looked confused, then concerned. "I'm okay," he said. "Don't cry. I'm okay." But they all knew this was the beginning of something hard. Something slow and painful. Something that would test the very threads they had just begun to mend. The family adjusted. They took turns checking in. Margaret kept a journal of Glenn's behavior, tracking changes. Emily researched memory exercises and dietary support. Daniel rearranged his work schedule to be home more often. But the hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was watching Glenn fade in pieces. He forgot names, then faces, then moments. Sometimes he'd tell stories from his youth, and they'd cling to them like treasures, because they were becoming rarer. Other times, he'd wake up in the middle of the night, unsure of where he was. Margaret would sit beside him, gently humming the song they used to dance to in the kitchen. "I'm still here," she'd whisper. "You're still with me." And some days when the fog lifted for a while, Glenn would smile and say, "You always knew how to find me." Those were the days that hurt the most. The clarity amidst the decline. In the middle of all this, something unexpected bloomed. Emily fell in love. His name was Jonah. A school counselor with a kind heart, awkward humor, and a surprising knowledge of 90s indie rock. They met at a community fundraiser. He spilled coffee on her shoes. She made fun of his shirt. It wasn't romantic at first, more like two puzzle pieces accidentally bumping into each other. But slowly, something clicked. He didn't try to fix her. He listened. And when she told him about her family, the years of silence, the hard road back, her father's diagnosis, he didn't flinch. He just nodded and said, "That sounds really hard. But you're not carrying it alone." When she introduced him to the family, Glenn had a rare good day. He smiled, shook Jonah's hand, and said, "She looks lighter with you around." Margaret later cried in the bathroom after hearing that. Daniel, surprisingly, like Jonah, the man wasn't flashy or overconfident, just genuine, steady, the kind of person you trusted instantly. And for Emily, that trust meant everything. As winter settled in, the family made a decision they would spend Christmas together again in the house, just like before. Margaret was hesitant at first. So much had changed. She feared it would feel like pretending again. But Emily insisted. "This isn't about recreating the past," she said. "It's about being together, however we are now." So they decorated, not with the old ornaments, in many of which Glenn no longer recognized it, but with new ones, each labeled with a memory from the past year. A clay mug from Margaret's first Etsy sale, a photo of Daniel with his mentees, a tiny painted cabin, a guitar pick from Jonah, and a paper star that simply said, "We're still here." On Christmas Eve, they sat around the fire again. Glenn was quiet but present. He watched them, eyes moving slowly from face to face as if memorizing them one last time. "I don't remember everything," he said suddenly, voice low. "But I remember this feeling." Margaret reached for his hand. Daniel passed around mugs of cocoa. Emily placed a blanket over Glenn's lap. Jonah tuned the old guitar in the corner, and for the first time in a long time, there was peace. Not the kind that came from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing you're not alone in the mess of life. In the new year, they made another big decision. Margaret would sell the house. It was too much. Too many stairs, too many rooms, too many memories that Glenn could no longer place. She and Glenn would move into a smaller, single-level home closer to Daniel and Emily. The decision was hard, gut-wrenching at times. Margaret walked from room to room one last time, whispering thank yous to the walls. Emily took pictures of every corner. Daniel made a video tour, and when they finally packed the last box, they didn't cry. They just stood on the porch, arm in arm, watching the snow fall. "Do you think he'll forget all of this someday?" Emily asked. Daniel looked at Glenn, who was staring at the yard like it was both familiar and foreign. "Maybe," he said, "but we won't." But that spring, Emily and Jonah got engaged. There was no dramatic proposal, no viral video, just a quiet moment on a walk, a simple question, and a yes spoken like a promise. The wedding was planned small, backyard, close family, string lights. Glenn had his good days and bad ones, but Emily didn't care whether he remembered every detail. She just wanted him there. And on that day, he was more than present. He walked her down the aisle, slow and steady, a proud smile on his face. He gave a toast, short and a little scattered but heartfelt. "I may not remember tomorrow," he said, voice trembling. "But today, I know this. My daughter is happy, and that's enough." No one had a dry eye. In the months that followed, life carried on. Glenn's memory faded more. Some days he called Daniel the doctor. Some days he asked Margaret when their kids would be home, forgetting they were adults now. But he was surrounded by love, by music and soft blankets and the familiar voices of people who never let go. Daniel continued to grow, not just in his career, but as a brother, a son, and someday soon, maybe a father. Margaret learned to rest, to let others help, to enjoy slow mornings and forget perfection. And Emily found peace. Not the kind you seek in silence, but the kind you build, piece by piece, after the storm. To be continued. Would you like Part V to explore Glenn's later years, the legacy he leaves, or perhaps the birth of a new generation that brings fresh life into the family? It began with a heartbeat, soft and fluttering, barely a whisper through the grainy screen of the sonogram, but strong enough to stop time. Emily stared at the monitor, her hand clutching Jonah's, her other resting on her stomach. The doctor smiled and pointed. "That's your baby's heartbeat?" But Jonah laughed, but it caught in his throat. Emily blinked, as if the moment might disappear if she looked away. They had talked about this, parenthood, quietly, cautiously. After everything they'd been through, Emily wasn't sure she could carry that kind of love, that kind of vulnerability. But as she lay there, hearing the tiny rhythm that would someday echo through her home in footsteps, laughter, and cries, she knew she was ready. And their family, for all its scars and storms, was ready too. When they broke the news to Margaret and Daniel, it was over dinner. A warm spring evening. Daniel brought wine, not knowing they wouldn't drink it. Margaret made her usual herb, roasted chicken, which everyone pretended hadn't become slightly dry with age. After the plates were cleared, Jonah stood and awkwardly tapped his glass with a spoon. "I think we need to tell you something before dessert," he said. Margaret blinked. "No, are you two moving again?" "No," Emily grinned. "We're growing." She placed a small white envelope in front of her mother. Inside was a sonogram. Margaret stared for a moment, then her lips parted. Oh my God." Her hand flew to her mouth, eyes welling. "Emily." Daniel reached for the photo, mouth breaking into a slow smile. "You're pregnant." Emily nodded and Jonah beamed beside her. "I'm going to be an uncle," Daniel said, half shocked, half overjoyed. Whoa. Margaret reached across the table to squeeze Emily's hand. "Your father's going to be so happy." Glenn's reaction was quieter. He didn't quite grasp the moment at first. didn't immediately understand why there were tears and smiles and toasts. But when Emily placed his hand gently on her belly and said, "You're going to be a grandfather again," something lit in his eyes. A flicker, a spark. He didn't say much, just smiled and nodded, and later, when he sat on the porch with Margaret, he whispered, "Tell me again, about the baby." And so she did, every night, like a story she didn't want him to forget. The pregnancy brought the family closer. Daniel took over handling bills and repairs for Margaret's house. He researched baby monitors like he was preparing for a court case and made spreadsheets comparing car seats. Margaret began knitting tiny booties and researching natural remedies like lavender baths and chamomile tea. Emily and Jonah painted the nursery a soft sage green. They hung stars from the ceiling, each one with a name written in marker: hope, wonder, peace, forgiveness, growth. A constellation of what had brought them to this point. Glenn had more bad days than good now. Some mornings, he forgot where he was. Some nights, he wandered. But he was never alone. Margaret was always there, steady and patient, holding on to the man she loved, even as pieces of him slipped away. And sometimes, in rare, lucid moments, Glenn would smile and say something so perfectly him that it made the whole family freeze. Once, while sitting in the garden watching the wind rustle the trees, he turned to Emily and said, "You'll be a good mother." "You know why?" Emily looked over, unsure if he was present. "Because you listen," Glenn said. "You always listened, even when you were quiet." She bit her lip, nodded, and tucked the memory away like a keepsake. When the baby came, it was a stormy night. The roads were slick, the sky a blur of lightning, and Jonah's driving was nothing short of dramatic. But inside the hospital, time stilled again. Emily gave birth to a baby girl, dark eyes, soft curls, and lungs that demanded the world listen. They named her Lena, after Glenn's grandmother, a woman who had crossed continents with a suitcase and a will of iron. Daniel was the first to visit. He stood at the foot of the hospital bed, looking oddly unsure of himself. "She's beautiful," he said. "Terrifying, but beautiful." But Emily laughed. Want to hold her?" He hesitated. "What if I drop her?" "You're a lawyer, not a klutz. Sit down." He did, and when Lena was placed in his arms, his eyes softened. "I didn't know I could love someone so fast," he whispered. Margaret arrived next, red-eyed from crying, holding a bouquet and a hand-knitted blanket. She bent over the crib and gently touched Lena's tiny hand. "You have no idea how much light you've already brought." Glenn came the next day. Margaret wheeled him into the room. He was quiet, confused by the noise, the strange bed, the beeping monitors. Emily knelt beside him, holding Lena close. "This is Lena, Dad. Your granddaughter." But Glenn blinked. His eyes fluttered from face to face, unsure. Then, slowly, he reached out. Lena grasped his finger, tight, and Glenn, with a clarity that felt like sunlight cutting through clouds, whispered, "Hello, little star." But the months after Lena's birth filled with both joy and sorrow. Emily adapted quickly, or as quickly as any new mother could. Sleepless nights, lullabies at 3 a.m., and the constant dance of feeding, rocking, and soothing. Jonah was her anchor, equal parts goofy and grounded. He read parenting books at night and made ridiculous animal noises to make Lena laugh. Emily knew she couldn't have done this without him. Margaret visited almost every day. She brought groceries, folded laundry, and stole as many minutes as possible holding her granddaughter. Sometimes she brought Glenn on his good days and watched as he hummed to Lena without remembering the melody or the words. And Daniel was different now. More patient, less hurried. He started dating someone, a pediatric nurse named Rachel. And for the first time in years, he talked about family not as an obligation, but as a dream. "You think you'll have kids someday?" Emily asked him once, teasing. He smiled. "Maybe, if I'm lucky. But right now I've got the best niece in the universe." That's enough? The last real moment Emily shared with her father came on a quiet October afternoon. The leaves had turned gold and crimson, and the sky was crisp. Glenn was sitting on a bench outside the memory care facility he'd moved into weeks earlier, staring at the trees. Emily brought Lena, now 6 months old and endlessly curious. She sat beside him, placed Lena in his lap, and waited. Glenn didn't speak, just rocked slightly, humming. Then, without looking at her, he said, "You grew strong." Emily blinked, her throat tightening. "You grew through all of it," he added. "And now you've grown something even more." "Oh?" She reached out, touched his hand. "I had a good teacher." They sat like that until the sun dipped below the horizon. It was the last time he said her name. Glenn passed away in early winter, peacefully, in his sleep. The family gathered at Margaret's house, the warmth of the fireplace echoing the hush of shared grief. They told stories. About the raccoon at the lake. About Glenn's strange obsession with pickled onions. About the way he always tapped his coffee mug twice before drinking. Lena, too young to understand, toddled around the living room, her laughter lifting the weight in the air. Margaret stood to speak at the small memorial they held in the garden. The trees were bare, but the wind was gentle. "My husband loved quietly," she said. "He didn't need applause. He just needed presence. And in the end, that's what mattered. He was there. For us. Even when he forgot the names, he never forgot the love." She looked at Emily, at Daniel, at Jonah, at Lena. "He planted something strong in each of us. And now, we carry it forward." That spring, they planted a tree in the garden. A sugar maple. Its leaves would blaze orange in autumn. Glenn's favorite color. Daniel carved a small wooden sign and hammered it into the soil. For Glenn, who never stopped growing, even in the quiet. While Emily held Lena close as she looked at the tree, the wind brushing through her hair. She thought of the long journey, the unraveling, the stitching, the storm, the healing. And now, this. A family no longer defined by what had broken, but by what they had rebuilt. Together. To be continued. Let me know if you'd like Part VI to explore the legacy Glenn leaves behind in Lena's life as she grows older. Maybe discovering old journals, learning about her family, and becoming the next storyteller. Lena was 7 years old the first time she asked about him. They were sitting in Margaret's living room, rain whispering against the windows, the smell of fresh cookies curling through the air. Emily was folding laundry on the couch, humming softly, while Lena sat cross-legged on the carpet, flipping through an old photo album with careful fingers. She paused on a photo of a man with kind eyes and a crooked smile, wearing a flannel shirt and standing in front of a lake. "Glenn." "Mom?" she asked. "Who is this?" Emily set down the towel in her hands. She walked over slowly, sitting beside her daughter. "That's your grandfather," she said gently. "Glenn." Lena studied the photo. "Was he nice?" Emily smiled. "He was the kindest man I've ever known." "Do I look like him?" "In your eyes," she said. And in the way you notice little things. He always paid attention to what most people missed." Lena turned another page, revealing a snapshot of the entire family at the lake house. Glenn, Margaret, Emily, Daniel, Jonah, and a tiny baby bundled in Emily's arms. Was I there too?" Emily nodded. "You were just a few months old." Lena traced her finger over the image. "Did he love me?" Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "So much, sweetheart. Even when he couldn't remember everything, he remembered that." It became a ritual. Every time Lena visited her grandmother's house, she'd ask for the photo album. Sometimes she'd bring her colored pencils and draw versions of the pictures. Other times, she'd ask stories, the kind that didn't need to be polished, just true. Margaret told her how Glenn once tried to fix the kitchen sink with a flashlight and duct tape, only to flood the entire floor. Daniel told her about the time Glenn dressed up as a giant bunny for Easter and accidentally scared all the neighborhood kids. Emily shared how he used to leave sticky notes all over the house. Reminders not just for himself, but for everyone else too. "You're doing great. Remember to smile at least once today. Hugs are free. Give one now." Lena collected these stories like precious stones. By the time Lena was 10, She had started writing them down. Not just Glenn's stories, but all the families. The way Margaret had taken up pottery at 65. How Daniel learned to cook after burning water. Yes, actual water. And how Emily once painted stars on her ceiling as a teenager and left them there until she moved out. She wrote them in a journal with a sunflower on the cover, carefully printing each entry in purple ink. She titled the first page, "The Family Who Fell Apart and Found Each Other Again." Daniel now settled into a calm rhythm of life with Rachel, who had long since become part of the family. Began writing too. He started a memoir, not for publishing but for Lena. A collection of letters, one for each year of her life, from Uncle D. He kept them in a leather-bound notebook, which he planned to give her on her 18th birthday. "You'll understand us better someday," he wrote in one. "And maybe you'll forgive us sooner than we forgave ourselves." Rachel was the one who encouraged him to start volunteering as a mentor again. This time not just for junior lawyers, but for at-risk teens. He taught them not just about law, but about listening, about empathy, about second chances. Glenn, he always said, had taught him that. Margaret eventually moved out of the house where she and Glenn had shared so much life and loss. She chose a quiet cottage by the edge of a wooded park, not too far from Emily and Lena. The walls were painted warm colors, and the kitchen smelled like rosemary and old recipes. Her pottery business, which she had once called a silly little hobby, had turned into something beloved in the community. She sold mugs with phrases like "love load," "rooted deep," and "it's okay to start over." Each mug came with a small folded card inside a memory of Glenn. She never stopped talking about him, not because she couldn't let go, but because remembering was how she kept living. Lena grew. She loved stories, loved sitting in Daniel's lap while he read them, loved asking questions halfway through. She'd sit with Jonah on Sunday mornings as he played guitar and made up silly songs about their cat, Toast. She asked Margaret to teach her how to make Creole, cocoa, not the powdered kind. She wrote poems that made no sense and yet were somehow exactly right. By 12, she had decided she would be a writer. Not just books, she explained, but true things, stories people forget to tell. The quiet ones. Emily smiled. "Like your grandfather." Exactly like him. When Lena turned 16, she asked if they could visit the lake house. Emily hesitated. It had been years. The last time she was there, her father was still alive. But Lena persisted, gently, with that same quiet strength Glenn once had. And so they went. Emily, Jonah, Daniel, Rachel, and Margaret all piled into 2 cars and drove out to the lake, now surrounded by taller trees and newer cabins. The original house was still there, weathered but sturdy. The owners had kept the deck and even the old swing on the tree out back. They rented it for the weekend. Lena spent the first night walking through the house with her journal in hand. She sat on the porch where Glenn had once sipped coffee and hummed. She lay on the grass where Margaret used to set up picnics. She wrote until the stars came out. Later that night, while everyone was asleep, Emily joined her by the fire pit. "You Mina said, every day?" Lena looked up. "I think he'd be proud." "Of all of us." Emily nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "I hope so." "I know so," Lena said, "because we didn't stay broken. We tried. We kept trying." They sat in silence, the fire crackling, the lake quiet and still. Years passed. Lena graduated with honors in literature. Her first book, Quiet Stories Remembering What Matters, was published when she was 23. It was part memoir, part family history, part poetry. A tapestry of truth woven with tenderness. In the dedication, she wrote to the man who forgot almost everything, but never forgot love. To the woman who kept going even when her heart broke. To the brother who became my second father. To the stories that taught me how to listen. And to the family that unraveled and removed something stronger. What would have been Glenn's 85th birthday. The family gathered under the sugar maple tree they had planted in the garden so many years ago. Its leaves were bright orange, just like he loved. They brought cocoa in mismatched mugs. They read letters aloud, some from the past, some freshly written. Lena recited a new poem. The tree stood tall above them, its roots deep, its branches wide. Just like them, a family still growing, a family still healing, a family that never let go, even when the pieces fell apart. The end. Let me know if you'd like a bonus epilogue, a version for audiobook narration, or a full printable compilation of all 6 parts formatted as one continuous story. Thanks for watching the video, subscribe, and like the video.